Hello, this is Derek Taylor for History of Early Modern Europe, HIST 129. This is our lecture on Jansenism, and this is one of our last lectures for the course. And this lecture kind of is getting us toward the end of the early modern period. It's going to cover the history of a movement within the Catholic Church in France and other parts of Europe, which, as you're going to see, is going to have a fairly direct impact on the French Revolution, which we never have heard of, but it's very important. It's not as well known as perhaps the Enlightenment, the work of the philosophes. We'll get to that next lecture on the origins of the French Revolution. This is more of a deep dive into background. I'm talking about this obscure movement because, as you're going to see, Jansenism, and it's going to be kind of hard to define actually to a certain degree what Jansenism is exactly, but it's going to touch on, or several things I've touched on so far in my lectures come together in Jansenism. Several developments in the history of early modern Europe that, get us toward the modern period come through Jansenism, are exemplified by us. That's what we're talking about this here. So let's get started with Jansenism and talk about what it is, where it comes from, and its origins have to do, to start off with the immediate post-Tridentine Church in Western Europe, the Catholic Church after the Council of Trent. And a couple of things to note here when we talk about the church in France. We need two terms I'm going to use a lot in this lecture. The first is the term Augustinian, and Augustinian refers to a type of piety, a type of theology related to St. Augustine of Hippo, who was the dominant theologian for most of the Middle Ages, indeed much of the early modern period in Western Christianity. But moreover, the piety that's associated with him, particularly, you can say, in Protestant circles, Calvinist and otherwise, but also, as you're going to see, it's what's going to typify this movement within the Catholic Church called Jansenism, a very intense, very austere piety associated with a very deep sense of sin, the need for God's grace, man's unworthiness. Generally, Jansenists were very pessimistic about human nature, its limitations. They tended to see, as we'll get into the details in a moment, they had theological positions which were very close in certain respects to certain types of Protestantism. So a little bit different than what you think. The second term I'm going to mention, this is actually in the outline there, the Gallican Church after Trent. What do we mean by Gallican? I mean the French church associated with the Roman Communion. But the church in France has a history which being kind of independent-minded, particularly being kind of nationalist. Going back to the Middle Ages, from the 13th and 14th centuries onward, the church in France tends to assert its rights against papal claims a lot of times. That's particularly three things: that the king in France is independent in temporal realm, the Pope can't interfere in his orders. They tend to, a lot of theologians in the Gallican Church support the superiority of general councils of the Pope. And they're in particular united to the king in their desire to limit papal intervention in France in the name of ancient canons. In other words, there's a lot of independent-mindedness, and there's a suspicion of papal authority to a certain degree. And I mention all this because this means that when Trent, I mentioned the Council of Trent, issued all these reforms to clean up the church and its problems, these reforms were resisted in France. And in fact, they never become public law in the kingdom for that reason. So they don't really they will eventually have an effect by the end of the 17th century. But this means that the church in France still has a lot of problems. They don't get reformed as quickly as they do in, say, Italy. Many bishops in France were not concerned with their flock. The reason for this is that many bishoprics were in the gift of the aristocracy in France, who used the church as a source of revenue or to give a career to incompetent relatives. Bishops were nominated by the king and usually appointed with the approval of a council of clerics, but this didn't really prevent a lot of unsuitable people from getting into the episcopate, which caused a lot of problems. The behavior of parish clergy was also a scandal. Things like drunkenness and other vices were endemic among a very poorly educated parish clergy, rural clergy. Seminary reforms that Trent had wanted to implement would not touch the French church really to the latter half of the 17th century. And so in the immediate decades after Trent, things are kind of bad. And in fact, the lower orders in France tend to see the priesthood as a means of social advancement, in the same way the aristocracy saw it as a means of patronage and family wealth. And likewise, religious orders were in a bad way. So you have a lot of corruption, a lot of problems still in France after Trent. What's going to happen in the early part of the 17th century is there's going to arise a group of men around King Louis XIII. He's the king that succeeds Henri IV in 1610 in France, who want to rectify the situation, who want to reform it, to purify it. And they are inspired by this kind of Augustinian piety and theology that I've already mentioned. This is widespread among the devout in early 17th century France. And I should mention, by the way, one of the things that is motivating, to a certain degree, the devout in the Catholic Church, they're embarrassed at the condition of it, but they actually do it and have some admiration for French Huguenots. Why? Because they don't have these problems. Remember, the French Huguenots are a minority, and the advantage of a religious minority has over an institution like the Catholic Church. You're a religious minority. The only reason you're there is because you believe. So you don't have to worry about people being there because, for other reasons, for material benefits. The Catholic Church, being this big entity, which is the entity of most of the kingdom, has what you might call in sociological terms a free rider problem. People who are there because they clearly don't believe anything, but they don't leave anyway. So, and this fires this because there is this general Augustinian piety they both share, these Catholic leaders. Most important of which around the king was a man named Cardinal Pierre Bérulle. He was a reformer allied with the 13th, and he became the patron of several religious communities that were intent on reforming religious life meaning monastic communities in France, as well as the founder of an oratory in 1605. An oratory is it's a sort of community of parish priests that live together. Again, give them some, support and all that stuff. And he becomes a leader in this group. It's called the Parti des Vaux, the devout party in French. In fact, he'll become a leading writer on spirituality in this circle. And he's also, at the same time, these things are intertwined, obviously, with political affairs, being an advisor to the king. And he actually, Berulle's, one of his goals was the overcoming of Protestantism in the kingdom, but also as you get into the 30 Years' War, favoring the Catholic side. Unfortunately, he helped advance the career of the man who was more Gallican in his sympathies and royalist in his policies. That would be Armand Duplessis de Richelieu. That's right, the Cardinal de Richelieu was made a bishop, and he provided his rise to power. Eventually, he'll become to oppose his former mentor, and in the 1620s, Richelieu will eventually win out and prevail with Louis XIII by the late 1620s. And in fact, just about on his death, Bérulle dies in 1629. Richelieu is about to have him exiled. And so it's in this situation when he dies, the Parti des Vaux is left without a leader, and in are going to step the leaders of this new movement, Jansenism. So to talk about this, I need to go back a few decades and where Jansenism is and what it comes from. And basically it comes from this debate over predestination and justification by faith, what that means. And if you recall, one of the distinctions between Protestants and Catholics was basically in terms of being justified, going from being sinful to being saved. Martin Luther, John Calvin, other Protestants thought that you could do nothing. You had no free will in regards to this. Well, the Council of Trent rejected this, and it basically refutes this idea and asserts that salvation is God's work, but that man is also called to contribute to it. And even though it's completed by God's grace, man has to cooperate with it. This is the quotation from the Council of Trent. I'll read to you here. Quote, while God touches the heart of man through the illumination of the Holy Ghost, man himself neither does absolutely nothing while receiving that inspiration, since he can also reject it, nor yet is he able by his own free will, without the grace of God, to move himself to justice in his sight, unquote. So your free will has to cooperate with God's grace. What's going to happen is, shortly after the council, A professor at the University of Louvain in Belgium, what is today Belgium, is going to create a system of thought based on the anti-Pelagian works of St. Augustine of Hippo. If you know what Pelagius was, Pelagius was an ancient theologian who argued that you could sort of earn your way to heaven. And in some of his late works, St. Augustine of Hippo wrote some really, really strong works against him, which, basically went so far as to say we didn't have free will, basically, in that regard. And I say this because Augustine's still one of the most revered theologians. He's a father of the church. And this theologian, Michel Bias, builds an entire system of thought on those works alone. I should mention that St. Augustine of Hippo says different things in different places about this question. For example, he never mentions this idea in anywhere in his sermons, but in these polemical works against this theologian, he did. This is where Luther and Calvin are getting this idea from as well. And this theologian Bias, Michel Bius, basically opposes the definition of Trent on justification. Eventually, this is going to bring forth opponents of this, particularly among the theologians associated with the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, particularly a man named Louis de Molina, who's going to make the opposite argument that basically God does allow us to sort of cooperate with him. Again, you're going to have this big thing to note is you're going to have this same debate that fed into the Reformation feed into Jansenism, because you're going to have this work, and it's going to get caught up in a lot of different things, because a lot of ruckus within the Catholic Church, particularly because you're going to have opposition. It gets tangled in all sorts of things we don't need to talk about here. But Molina's a Jesuit. A lot of his opponents are Dominicans. There's rivalry between religious orders. Doesn't need to concern us here. The big thing here is this debate really never was resolved. Both sides began lobbying charges of heresy against each other. Disputations are held at various universities until Rome steps in the early 17th century, late 16th century, I should say, sets up a congregation to examine the matter, meets for 9 years, and fails to come to a conclusion. And so in the end, the Pope just says, you should all shut up and stop arguing about this. Otherwise, we'll have a schism or something. So this is that debate come back to life. Now, what happens, of course, is that this doesn't shut down the debate. And in fact, you're going to have one person begin to try to restart this on the side, essentially, of Bias, on the side of, no, you can't really resist grace. And the man's name is Cornelius Jansen, for whom the movement we call Jansenism gets its name. Came from a poor family and studied the theology at the universities of Louvain and Paris, where he would meet his friend, a man named Jean Duvergier de Oran, who will become the Abbé de Saint-Cyran, and they'll become lifelong friends and confidants. He'll be ordained, he'll receive his doctorate, and he'll go back and teach at the University of Louvain. And I should mention Louvain's in what at that point is the Spanish, will eventually become the Austrian Netherlands, the part of the Low Countries in Catholic control. It's right on the border with, or close to the border with, the Protestant Netherlands, the Calvinists, the Dutch. And while he's at Louvain, he begins writing a project for a systematic exposition of the thought of St. Augustine. And eventually, he will begin doing this. In fact, he'll publish works opposed to Richelieu's policy during the 30 Years' War. And he finally manages to complete his work on Augustine a few days before his death in 1638. And the work is called Augustinus, and we'll come back to this because this will be the source of most of Jansenist thinking, at least in its first phase. The other sort of those two figures, Saint-Cyran, we'll come back into a moment, and Jansen are one part of it, sort of godfathers of it. The other major supporters come from a sort of amazing family called the Arnaud family. Arnauds are sort of middling class stock in a place called Auvergne in France. And in particular, the father of this family is a man named Antoine. And it's his children that are going to sort of become the major figures in this movement, especially after the deaths of Saint-Cyran and Jansenis. Antoine Arnauld, sometimes called Le Grand Arnauld, who become the major theologian of the entire movement, probably the person who's most responsible for this becoming what it was. He will also have 6 daughters who will enter a convent, which I won't have time to go into here, which is associated with the Jansenist party in the French church. Particularly 2 of them, Jacqueline, or called Angelique Arnauld, and Jeanne Catherine Agnes, or Mother Agnes, who become prominent in making this Abbé Deschamps de Port-Royal the center of this. So this abbey, this convent, will be the center of all this, as well as others. And so you have and that's just a handful of them. This family provides most of the manpower for all this. And in fact, you're going to have eventually you're going to have this a new order established by Mother Agnes, one of these Arnauld sisters, called the Institute of the Holy Sacrament. And so it's going to get attacked for its orthodoxy for a variety of reasons. And she's going to find in this a defense by the Abbé de Saint-Cyran. And what's going to happen is he's going to become her spiritual director. And so you have this, again, this sort of clique of theologians and nuns and ecclesiastics. And eventually you're going to have the nephew of Mère Angelique come and live with this convent without becoming a priest or religious. You're going to have, they're called solitaires, which are going to have a bunch of young men, about 40 of them, come and live as single celibate laymen in this sort of this weird sort of community they have at Port Royal. So it's kind of this weird, how do I put this, I'm going to put it in modern terms, is a wrong way to understand it, but hyper conservative part of the church, which is almost kind of countercultural in a way, weirdly enough. In fact, because they're both critical of the movement itself, but also of the church itself, but also, of course, the policies of someone like Richelieu, which is what gets Saint-Cyran in trouble. Again, just like his friend Berulle, he will criticize Richelieu's policies. Richelieu has him arrested. He'll eventually die in prison in 1643, shortly after the cardinal's death himself. So you have this early movement, which is beginning to criticize. It'll come out in the open in the 1640s after his death a lot. This conflict with what they see as a corrupt church in the 1640s and 50s. Just want to show you some images of the main figures of Jansen. Get a sense for what it's like. This is the man himself, Cornelius Janssens, the Bishop of Ypres in the Belgium, but Lower Netherlands. See, it looks like there. This is Jean Vergier du Oran, the Abbé de Saint-Cyran. Again, another austere-looking guy. Austere is the word you want to use when you're talking about Jansenism. This is a painting, I'm not really sure when it was done, sometime in the 17th century, of Agnes and Angelique Arnauld before the Abbey of Port-Royal des Champs, the abbey they found. You can see it in the background there, what it looked like, this rural area. You can see them dressed in their habits. Again, very austere. There's no mouth that's there. But it was this family that's, again, made up the bulk of the sort of inner circle of this movement. On the one hand, you have Antoine Arnauld, Le Grand Arnauld on this side, the 2 champions, the 2 most famous writers in their day for the movement on the left-hand side, Antoine. And then on the right, another man we have already encountered in the lecture on the Baroque, Blaise Pascal, mathematician, but also a controversial writer. As you'll see, he'll write one of the most famous works associated with the Jansenists. Not his work, the Pensée, if you know what that is. That was intended to be his defense of Christianity. Not that work, but this work, other works were actually more famous in his lifetime because they, as you'll see, were involved in controversies. And then one last picture I want to show you. This is actually a painting, obviously, which is by a painter named Philippe du Champagne, who was a painter in the 1670s. He almost certainly painted that painting of the 2 Arnauld sisters And you can actually find this if you go to the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City, this painting is there. But I put it here for you just to give you an idea of the sort of, moral imagination, if you like, of Jansenism, what it's like. This is his Christ on the cross, Calvary. It's a traditional subject for painters in the 17th century, but look how dark it is. Look how foreboding the sky is. It's this very shadowed, kind of sad looking, looking image. It does capture something of the spirit of Jansenism. It's very austere. It tends to see pleasure as being sinful. It's very, again, it's not something you would see as modern. I say this because one of the reasons we're doing this is it does give birth to a sort of modernizing movement. You'll see why as we go forward here. And one of the reasons is they attack the establishment in church and state. And in particular, the Jansenists will become famous for making an attack on the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus. And this comes back to Jansenius's Augustinus. And again, remember, Augustinus's work is inspired by this Augustinian idea that we don't have free will in regards to grace, at least that some of Augustine's works. And of course, the Jesuits are the opposite here. They are the heirs of Thomas Aquinas, and they see his work as belittling human freedmen and restricting salvation only to a few. And in fact, it's the Jesuits who very soon after that work comes out in 1640 coined the phrase Jansenist. And the Jesuits were the sort of heirs of Renaissance humanism and optimism. They found Jansen's work repellent, even heretical. And so you're going to have this knockdown, drag out debate about these things. I'm not going to go too much into the theological woods here, to say the least. It was a very learned work, was Augustinus, about who was true and what's not. And in fact, for the most part, as you're going to see, as much as it sounds like, and this is one of the attacks that Jesuits make on Jansenius and his followers, is that, well, it sounds Protestant. And it is true. He makes some statements like this. For the most part, Jansenius or Jansen, whatever we call him, they're Catholic. They sound sometimes like they take that line. And in particular, Jansen does hold to a really dour notion of human nature, and particularly about the sort of the irresistibility of grace in a fallen condition. Because that's the one thing, the real big thing coming out of Trent is they take this idea that no, you can accept grace, you can cooperate with it, you're free to reject it. And that's one of the things that bothers a lot of Jansenius and his followers. So at first trying to prevent the publication of this work, and then the French court is trying to condemn it, the Jesuits appealed to Rome. And in the meantime, you have this massive war going on in which the Holy Office tries to actually condemn both sides for breaking silence of, remember, they had tried to shut this debate down earlier, Rome didn't work. And so for the first time, not the last time, Rome, the Pope at the time, Alexander VII, steps in and issues a bull repeating the condemnation about the Holy Office, about breaking silence on the debate. But it was basically ignored in France, except for allowing people to directly attack Antoine Arnauld, who was now the main leader of this Jesuit party. And so Arnauld pivoted. He went and started attacking the lax morality of the church in France, particularly that of the Jesuits, instead of attacking, these abstract ideas about salvation and justification and things. He instead portrayed them as not taking sin seriously and letting people have absolution from sin who did not show contrition. What he means is, the teaching is in Catholicism, you have to, confess your sins before you go take the Eucharist, otherwise you condemn yourself. And the Jesuits practiced something called casuistry a lot in the 17th century. Casuistry is sort of the science of difficult cases in a moral sense. And they could be famous for, not all of them, not a lot. There were actually a lot of them were opposed to this, but some Jesuits got, a reputation for being very lax. basically coming up with excuses why you really weren't sinful, and you could take communion when you probably shouldn't. And what Arnaud meant by criticizing this was things like aristocrats going from, Arnaud, again, the even idea of the strictness of the Jansenists. He didn't mean, by the way, people who like killed someone and went took communion. He meant like aristocrats going from confession to a ball afterwards. So this is the kind of thing we're talking about. But his work, especially frequent communion, this becomes a flashpoint. The Jansenists thought that most people shouldn't take communion too often. Why? Because they thought most people were really sinful, and if they did, they would be damned if they did this. And in fact, this is going to be something of a flashpoint well into it. It's going to be something. It's a big issue, because in fact, the Catholic Church going into modern period is going to advise the opposite. It's going to advise its flock to take it as often as possible. But the Jansenists say, no, we're all too sinful for that. And what's explosive about this, more than anything, in addition to the actual contents, is that it not only goes from these abstract doctrines to something very concrete people can understand. Arnaud wrote this pamphlet in French and not in the language of Latin, the language of learning, so it appealed to a wider public. So this blows up in the 1640s and on to the 1650s. So much so that by the early 1650s, the next pope will issue a bull condemning 5 propositions, which he says are taken from the work by Jansen. And even though it doesn't name Jansenius or his work, and I won't go through all these, but basically it's a rejection of these Jansenist ideas that you can't resist grace, that basically that, again, you have these ideas that are very strict, and it condemns them. Now, having been condemned by the Pope, these propositions, well, one of the things they did was, the Jansenists, especially Arnaud, is that he agreed all these propositions were heretical, but he denied they could be found in Jansen's book. And Arnaud said, well, they're not actually there in the book. He's wrong, by the way. The exact words aren't found there, but they're actually found in the propositions are found in Augustine Jansen's book. But he invents this distinction that's between doctrine, or I should say right or doctrine, and fact. In other words, he invents this idea that the Pope has the power to decide the issue of doctrine, but not the issue of whether facts are in the book or not. And again, if you recall, this is the age in which the idea of fact is being created as something independent, right, of human interpretation, if you like. And so this is his way around trying to get around this condemnation from the Pope. It does not work. The Pope rejects this, and in fact, Arnaud will be removed from his position. He teaches at the Sorbonne, the famous university in Paris, in 1656. At the same time, you had that pamphlet war between the Jesuits and Jansenists going on. You had Pascal publish his provincial letters, and these are purported to be letters from someone in the countryside talking about Jesuits. And they are really popular because they skewer the Jesuits. They mock their purported laxity in worship. And what happens is 2 things. 1, it becomes really popular. 2, this pamphlet and other pamphlets draw the ire of Louis XIV. Because Pascal and his friend Pierre Nicole have a large following among the regular clergy. He sees them, Louis does, as stirring up the lower orders. He also, not wrongly, sees these attack on these, Jesuit lax morals as an attack on his court, which it kind of is. And Louis actually says that these Jansenists are, quote, a sect inimical to all forms of lordship, whether temporal or spiritual, unquote, inspired by a, quote, spirit of independence, unquote. So it brings upon them the ire of the King of France, which will be important going forward, because it will be dangerous to draw the ire of the absolute monarch who basically controls the church in France. In 1656, the Pope at the time tries to issue a clarification that the propositions, yes, were in Jansenism's work, and yes, his predecessors didn't mean to combine his ideas. At the same time, and he also, by the way, ad sanctum basically says that yes, the Pope has the right to determine dogmatic facts in that sort of case. And this triggers, and this brings into a different mention of the debate. It triggers resistance from among bishops sympathetic to Jansen's followers, who are Gallicans, who don't like the fact that Pope is intervening in French affairs this way. And in fact, Alexander the Seventh, the Pope at the time, will issue a formulary or an oath linking the propositions to Jansenius. This had been imposed by Louis and the French bishops earlier, but now had papal backing. So this just made a bigger mess, because now you've thrown in, besides these issues of salvation and all this stuff, the issue of the French church's independence from Rome. Till finally things get so bad in 1667, a new Pope, Clement IX, suggests a truce whereby the combatants sign a formulary which leaves out the debate about right and fact, allowing for private disagreement on that issue. Most of the Jansenists wind up taking this oath, but in the end, it really does not decide any issue, and satisfies no one, as you will see. Now, a couple of things to note here about this movement so far. This sounds like it's a pretty abstract debate. What does this have to do with us? One of the things you've already heard, though, and one of the things that happens after 1669, when there's this truce, it doesn't last that long, is that in the absence of fighting about these things, the Jansenists will turn to literary concerns, historical concerns, and to publications to continue their movement. I've already kind of mentioned this, that there's a use of the vernacular press for the Jansenists with regards to the debate on frequent communion in the 1640s. And this is one of the things that'll make Jansenism a real movement. They'll try to appeal to a wider public. They'll actually have success in publishing. One of the more popular works of any sort of piety in the late 17th century is Pierre Nicole's moral essay. It's called Essai Moral in French, and it's read widely throughout Western Europe by Protestant thinkers. It's a sort of short moral treatise on the basis of a Christian life. John Locke, for example, definitely read Pierre Nicole's. He actually translated Pierre Nicole's moral essays. John Locke didn't like Catholicism at all. The only works we have in his library at the end of his life, John Locke's library, were works by people like Blaise Pascal and Pierre Nicole, who were Jansenists. But they did other things besides this. This is the age, and I should get the context for this. The 17th century is seeing the beginnings of modern scholarship in regards to things like the study of the church fathers, patristic studies, historical studies. During the 16th century, there was a big polemical history put together by Protestants in Germany called the Magdeburg Centuries, which gave a history of the church up till about the midpoint of the Middle Ages, meaning to sort of justify the Protestant cause. This was responded to by a bishop named Baronius, a Catholic bishop from Italy, wrote a history of church history which followed on this. So you're having this, they're getting into historical studies to make their case in this regard, but also on things like, again, the church fathers. You're going to have biblical scholarship, editions of the church fathers being published by both sides, Protestant and Catholic. And that's going to be what they do. You're going to have several of them. Particularly Pierre Nicole will write his moral essays. You're going to have a bishop named Bossuet who will write an exposition of the doctrine of the Catholic Church. And so all these things they contribute to. This is what you do, by the way, when you are shut down, when you are censored by authorities. You turn to the past to sort of talk about these things without talking about them. Dissidents do this all the time did this all the time in places like the Soviet Union. So this is kind of what they're doing by doing this. They also, because of all the attacks on their faith, get into controversies with Protestants over things like the Eucharist. For all the similarities that Jansenius and his followers had with Calvinism, especially, they never denied key Catholic doctrines like the doctrine of the real presence in the Eucharist and stuff like that. They did have similarities in terms of there were Jansenists who, in liturgical terms, didn't like the sort of Baroque liturgy that came out of the Council of Trent. They advocated for a simplified version of the liturgy in the vernacular in certain circumstances. So you do have, there's similarities there, but at least they always argued that they never were technically Protestants. But so they get into this controversy with Protestants to try to burnish their reputation. And then finally, a figure who's going to be kind of transitional here because he's part of this movement, but it kind of becomes something else in the early 18th century, is Pasquier Cunel, was a biblical scholar, but also a patristic scholar who published an edition of St. Leo's the Great's works, translations of the Spanish mystics of the 16th century, St. Teresa and John of Avila, a biblical translation from the Vulgate and from the Greek New Testament. So he's a friend of Antoine Arnauld. Things will take a different direction when Cunel becomes the main figure in this movement. And so the peace doesn't last very long about this. And in fact, what's going to happen is, in revenge for attacks on the monarchy, Louis XIV is going to evict all the novices from Port Royal in 1679. All novices, confessors, and pupils. What this means is novices, you know what novices are. Novices are future nuns and future monks. Get rid of novices, you have no future. And that was the whole point. He wanted to get rid of this center of opposition to his rule. Again, in retaliation for this. In response to this, shortly thereafter, Antoine Arnauld will flee to the Netherlands. And again, remember, the Netherlands is a little more free. We're talking about the Austrian Netherlands at this point. He'll go to Brussels. And 1684, Pasquier Cunel will also flee from France and join him in Brussels. And you're going to have the beginnings of a movement in the Netherlands. This is the beginning of the spread of Jansenism from France. It'll become a European movement, at least in terms of ideas, in the 18th century. But in fact, it's in exile from France that, in fact, Cunel is going to make a lot of contacts all across France and other parts of Europe, getting ideas out there. He's going to write something, a book which is a commentary on the New Testament, with the New Testament Moral Reflections, 1695, which is going to cause a lot of scandal, partly not because it's necessarily all that Jansenist. It doesn't have a lot of those ideas about salvation in them. What it'll have is ideas that are basically Gallican ideas in them. And so it's a weird sort of, it'd be a challenge to papal authority more than anything else. But that's why it's going to take a different turn with him, partly because he has so many correspondents across the continent, and it'll become a movement in many ways under his direction. And because by 1695, the earlier generation, this is an important point, most of the Arnauld have passed away. Pascal has passed away. From this point onward, Jansenism is going to shift. It's no longer going to be, as you're going to see, primarily, or at least wholly, a theological or ecclesiastical movement. It's going to begin to seep into other parts of French and then European life. And what's going to happen is that in 1702, you're going to have that peace that had been put into place in 1669 get blown up, because you're going to have somebody publish something called a case of conscience, submitted to the Faculty of Theology in Paris. But it's over the question of whether or not absolution can be given to someone espousing a politic silence in the face of that question of, can the church determine facts as well as doctrine? And it was basically meant to force the hand of people like Cunel, because they'd been silent because they really didn't agree with the Pope and with the king on this. And in fact, they basically exposed Jansenist positions on things like communion, Bible in the vernacular. They also wanted Bibles in the vernacular. They didn't like Marian devotion that much. There was a lot of like devotional things that the Jansenists didn't like a lot with the Baroque Counter-Reformation church. And eventually, Cornell was arrested in May of 1703. And what happened was they found all these letters to his activity throughout the continent. And this was, of course, even in Rome. And this was seen as a blatant, breach of the quote unquote peace of the church. And so finally, Louis XIV, tired of waiting for the nuns at Port Royal to die, he forces them to abandon the abbey and demolishes it in 1711, throwing the remains of the dead nuns into a mass grave. Ugh, can you imagine? And in fact, by this point, the feud over Cornell's work, which is still ongoing, reaches Rome. You have attacks on his work by Archbishop Fenelon, as a supporter of the monarchy. Well, Cornell has a defender in the Bishop of Paris. At this point, Louis XIV steps in and asks Rome for a bull condemning Cornell. And this is where Clement XI issues Unigenitus, a bull called Unigenitus, which is meant to censure with qualifications 101 excerpts from his book, New Testament with Moral Reflections. Now, one thing that's going to happen is this is going to stir up a hornet's nest. The reason why is, one of the things I have to mention here is that most people never really went fully on board with all the details of the Jansenist positions I've outlined earlier. Most people who supported them were just sort of generic Augustinian type Christians or Catholics who, wanted to support a more austere, meaningful faith. And this is important because in Unigenitus, it's a really sloppy document. And it winds up condemning not only things that could be found in Jansenius, but things that are really not heretical. It really is kind of a misstep by the Pope. It basically condemns almost any form of Augustinian piety, most of which was, of course, perfectly, according to Catholic doctrine, orthodox. And so it led to the minority of the bishops, French bishops, headed by the Bishop of Paris, objecting to this approach and asking for a revision. But their resistance infuriated Louis XIV, who basically abandoned his Gallican principles and died a few days before the National Council that was held to convict him. And in fact, emboldened by the situation, his some of these opponents appealed to a future council against Unigenitus. And I say that's where you get the name appellates, because they're appealing to, again, a future council against the Pope. Again, this is a very Gallican position. And in fact, in reaction to this, the Pope will actually issue another bull forbidding any interpretation of Unigenitus and declaring the appellants excluded from communion. And so you're going to have this campaign against these bishops and priests being used throughout the 1720s and 30s by the government. This is important to note here, because now you're getting, this is turning slowly, this Jansenist controversy, into a political situation, because the government's going to use a legal device called lettres de cachet, letters of cachet, which is a letter signed by the king and countersigned by a secretary of state, and used primarily to authorize someone's imprisonment. And he's going to do this again. You're going to have this, and this is going to do is it's going to call forth a criticism by Jansenists that this violates the fundamental laws of the kingdom. And I said this is what's going to feed into what sometimes the second wave of Jansenism is sometimes called political Jansenism, because it's going to become effectively an opposition movement within the Kingdom of France and elsewhere. At the same time, you also have a schism opening up in the Netherlands. Long story short, you're going to have a missionary bishop who is a Jansenist sympathizer who's suspended for acting as a consecrator of bishops on behalf of a cathedral in Utrecht. And what's going to happen is it's going to be consecrated by one of these Jansenist bishops in France. this bishop in Utrecht will consecrate his successors. And so you're going to have a schism. You're going to have the founding of what's called the Old Catholic Church in the Netherlands, which it still exists to this day, by the way. It's a minor schism. It's never got very large, but it's still there, all helped out by this, this Jansenist controversy. Whereas at the same time, the Jansenists are going to do something very unique, which again, I'm talking about it being a modern movement. By the late 1720s, particularly after one sympathetic cardinal is exiled, using the letters de cachet, you're going to have a periodical created specifically to oppose this type of, campaign against these appellants. And it's by a couple of brothers who have found this, Jean-Baptiste and Marc-Antoine de Sassal, and it's called Nouvelle Ecclésiastique. And these guys both come from wealthy merchant families, and I don't want to belabor this too much. It's not totally true. A lot of the lay members of the Jansenists, both in the 17th and 18th centuries, do come from merchant families or, that sort of middle class type of family. So if you want to see it as sort of, that being part of this as well. In any event, begins in 1728. After they secure publishers who are willing to avoid the police because it's illegal. They distribute these things, this what essentially is a newspaper, anonymously to correspondents who relay copies to multiple printing houses, so they can assure that the arrest of one publisher doesn't halt production. And distributors, sell issues cheaply near stagecoaches and in front of boutiques, et cetera, et cetera. And so you have something like 6,000 copies each week being distributed by this Nouvelle Ecclésiastique. And you have, basically it's reporting on all the abuses that revolt from Unigenitus and the use of letters de cachet. And they disparage this, and it's all these detrimental effects on Jansenists. And so again, it becomes a leading critique of the government and its policies from a Gallican Jansenist perspective, amazingly enough, on these sorts of things. Even as, meanwhile, Unigenitus becomes law. And when it becomes public law, it means clergy can be deprived of their living, of their financial stipends, basically, by not signing it. One of the things that happens to make this a movement and sort of gets it beyond its ecclesial boundaries in the early 18th century is that Jansenism will find, especially in this case of the Parlement, this case of the appellants and the appealing against Unigenitus, support in the Parlement of France. The Parlement are 13, there's sort of 13 bodies that are created. They were created in the Middle Ages by the monarchy to help dispense justice in his name. And if you recall, the medieval, national parliament, the Estates General, hadn't been called in 1614. Well, since then, the local parliaments of all the French provinces had sort of picked up the slack of things that were no longer done by that Estates General. Quasi-administrative functions related to things like, charity, education, et cetera, et cetera. And they made, these parlementaires came to see themselves as being a check on royal authority. They would make arguments that royal decrees were not binding unless parliaments had registered them as laws. And they were part of a serious opposition to, well, French absolutism in the 18th century. In particular, they have a real strong sense of themselves, to these parlementaires, as they call them, because these offices in these local parliaments, these local bodies, these local legal bodies, had been purchased, and they had been made over time. Well, first of all, some of them had bought their way into the nobility. It's called nobility of the robe, noblesse de la robe, where you could buy a title and become part of the nobility. And that's part of the support of the absolute monarch in the 17th century. But it allowed some of these parlementaires to make these offices part of their family patrimony. So they became hereditary. So they become, these parlementaires, part of the landowning elite. And this gives them a sense of, hey, we have a stake in government here. And in fact, during the 18th century, especially after Louis XIV's death and the regency of his son in the early 1720s, they regain some of the ground they lost during Louis's reign. And in fact, they're going to take up, a lot of them are going to have Jansenist sympathies and their espousal of this sort of anti-absolutist framework. To give you one example, if you know who the French philosopher Montesquieu was, he was a Barrowman. He was also a parlementaire. And again, I say there's going to be an inspiration of Jansenism in these parliaments as they're called. Not necessarily theological. It's mostly this sort of opposition to absolute monarchy and its abuses that they pick up, although there'll be some of that there. And it will feed into it this way. At the same time all this is going on, you also have something else breaking out with all these sort of, this, if you like, a persecution of Jansenists and people who deny, these doctrines. You're going to have I don't know how to put this, a series of religious, the word they use in the 18th century is enthusiasm. Explain. In 1727, a Jansenist priest, a deacon, I should say, died in Paris, named Francois de Paris. 2 days later, when he was interred in the cemetery of Saint-Médard in Paris, crowds of people came in from every order of society, most of them from the people, middle class. They began to flock to his grave, and they claimed to be witness miraculous healings of incurable diseases performed by the virtuous holy man. And so people began to come to these miracles of Saint-Médard over the next couple of years. Some people had doubts about this. In November of 1730, a sensational healing was recorded of a woman, which was doubted and declared false by a pastoral letter of the Bishop of Paris. There's skepticism on the part of authorities. Still, additional miracles get reported, and this creates just a whole flood of people over the next several years. And what happens at some point is that another woman claims to be healed and is beset by violent seizures, where people are just literally shaking and convulsing all over. And this spreads to other visitors who come to this cemetery. And after a while, these crowds become so violent in their convulsions, fights break out. And in order to try to get rid of this, the king finally just orders the cemetery shut down in 1732. Nevertheless, these so-called, they call them convulsionnaires. This doesn't stop this. They begin to meet these convulsionnaires in their own homes in the 1730s, in Paris, in other French cities like Nantes and Troyes. And this goes on for decades, and they appear to again, these convulsionnaires have only a tenuous connection in some ways to Jansenism. There were Jansenists who supported them. They thought these were signs that God had favored the Jansenists who were being persecuted by the government. But increasingly, these convulsionnaires became very, very extreme. They would go through what they called a release, a sécours, which involved, this is weird stuff, a beating of the individual who was experiencing the convulsionaries. You would have they would meet together and have them beat each other, essentially. The whole idea was to release the individual from the experience of these convulsions, which could be very painful. But it became clear that this is kind of an unhealthy thing. These convulsionaries tend to see the body as sinful, the site of corruption. In 1736, 80 of these convulsionaries were arrested, actually, for beating and cut each other up and doing all this stuff. Some of them even practiced crucifixion with nails. Again, they're trying to literally reenact the crucifixion of Christ. Again, I mentioned initially supported by the Jansenists. The Nouvelle Ecclésiastique definitely supported them for the first several years. By the early 1740s, even they had abandoned them. But this stuff went on for decades. And by the way, if you're wondering if there isn't something even more sinister about some of this, there were some people there were some hints of sort of sexual abuse among these people as well, as you can kind of imagine. One weird thing, though, by the way, we don't know much about it because we don't have a lot of evidence, but one of the supporters of the convulsionaries was the brother of Voltaire, Armand. That's right, Voltaire, the Enlightenment figure. We don't know much about it. He only makes passing reference to his brother, who he did not care for, obviously. but apparently he was involved in this stuff. Very weird, very strange. In any case, you have a renewed clash over communion in the 1740s and 1745. A Jesuit, French Jesuit, published a book condemning Jansenist doctrines on unworthy communion. His book is condemned by the Holy Office. Then the Archbishop of Paris refuses last rites to unrepentant repellents who won't take the oath in regards to all this. So much so that by the 1750s, the king and the Pope at the time, Benedict XV, have to try to impose silence again on all this stuff. So again, it's amazing. One last thing is there is, and God, I don't have the dates here, but I think it's 1756, early 1750s. There's an attack, attempted assassination on the king's life by a man named Damiens. And apparently he has some sort of Jansenist leanings, or at least there's thought that he might have Jansenist leanings. At least the Jesuits try to blame this on the Jansenists. And this goes back and forth. And so you can see how all this stuff over religious doctrine and fights over that is feeding into, because of course the monarchy and the church are so connected, to these political battles in the 18th century. By the end of the 18th century, Jansenism does begin to sort of reach its peak influence and decline pretty quickly. However, its ideas begin to make an impact in places like they had not before in the empire. They're also, by the way, spread through Cunell's networks into Italy, as we'll get to in a moment, from the early 18th century. But in the 1760s especially, an auxiliary bishop of Trier publishes a work under the pseudonym Justinus Febronius called "On the Church and on the State of the Church," which basically criticizes papal authority, all arguing over the church, as that is, arguing that all bishops are equal, that the Pope has no jurisdiction outside his own see, and that infallibility resides in the whole church. In effect, he's calling for the creation of a national German church or body subject to the prince as a department of government. And this work will get condemned, but it also will have a lot of influence among the advisors of the Empress of Austria, Maria Theresa, as well as the other ideas of Jansenist and Gallican ideas, which in turn will influence the reforms of Joseph II. If you don't know who this is the Emperor of Austria in the 1780s. Won't have much time to talk about him. I think you'll have talk about him in the book. This is, by the way, if you don't know, this is the emperor who's the Emperor of Austria when Mozart is writing in Vienna and working, the famous composer. But he will be sort of an Enlightenment absolute monarch. He will actually reform the church in Austria. He'll basically seize church property and nationalize it, and has a very Enlightenment view of authority. But it comes from partly influence of Jansenist ideas about opposition to the monarch at this point. Finally, something happens in the 1760s, which is kind of unexpected, but you have attacks increasingly on the Jesuits by these Parlements, especially the Parlement of Paris, which is the most powerful one, which in 1761 issues a decree saying that the Constitution of the Society of Jesus was incompatible with the laws of the Kingdom of France. And in particular, influenced by Jansenist parlementaires, who, again, they're portraying themselves as being sort of like, in modern terms, progressives. They managed to secure from the king the expulsion of the society from France. At this point, the Jesuits had already been expelled from Portugal, and I want to say from one other country. And they're going to be eventually expelled from other countries as well. And by 1773, with the urging of Louis XV and other monarchs, Clement XV, the Pope, will actually abolish the Society of Jesus totally and get rid of them. They'll eventually come back, but they're actually done away with. So this is the kind of revenge of Jansenism, almost by proxy, which marks, by the way, its last gasp in France as anything like an organized, even then, by then it's more or less not, but anything like religious or theological Jansenism kind of peters out for the most part. You'll still have supporters. You'll still have people adverting to Jansenist works. for example, when you get to the revolution itself. And in fact, the Nouvelle Ecclésiastique, that newspaper these Jansenists started, will outlast the revolution. It will only cease publication in 1803. So it goes way beyond the bounds I'm talking about here. But effectively, it's become a political thing. And people use the term Jansenist, by the way. They're referring to any sort of opposition, more or less, by the late 18th century. The last gasp of any sort of theological statement of Jansenism, it takes place in Italy. It had gotten into Rome in the 1750s. But it retained a following in the northern parts of Italy that were close to the empire. And so what happened is a synod was convoked by a bishop named Ricci, which was preceded by a series of consultations with Jansenists and Parists, as well as people from the Church of Utrecht, the schismatic church, and by publications, which were condensed into 57 points of ecclesiastical reform, sent to all the letters of the pastors of the Diocese of Pistoia. And these points were concerned with a lot of things Jansenists had been concerned with since the late 17th century. Updating of seminary studies, revision of the catechism and the liturgy, the mass, other ceremonies, more just distribution of goods in the church, the purification of public and private piety, meaning getting rid of some stuff that was superstitious. In other words, getting rid of the Baroque piety, basically. And taking a fairly Gallican approach to authority in the church as well. And advocating things like a vernacular liturgy. And so it's this very, very, it issues this document that's this wildly sort of, for its time, I guess, modernizing to a certain degree, set of trends. Some of which, by the way, will actually be enacted after the Second Vatican Council by the Church, most notably the vernacular liturgy. It's condemned several years later by the Pope, and it comes to nothing. But it's the sort of last gasp of this, and it's kind of weird. I don't have time to go much into this, but Jansenism plays into the European Enlightenment. There is sometimes what scholars will talk about, especially in the first half of the 18th century. There are Catholic clergy, Catholic writers who are faithful Catholics who do embrace the Enlightenment, and it kind of touches into that sort of current of thinking. But of course, after this, it dies. The biggest reason is because it gets swallowed by a much bigger cataclysm, that of the French Revolution and its fallout. So finally, a couple of reflections about Jansenism. Why this weird, this weird sort of backward-looking movement which caused such dissension in the Catholic Church? Why am I pointing out as being modern? It's a question. You can go again. It's the fundamental beliefs of at least the first generation, that first wave in the 17th century, is very anti-modern, but it has a lot of the same characteristics as other modernizing movements that we're going through in this period. It's led by a small, mostly lay. That's one thing about it. It's mostly a movement of laymen and mostly laymen. There's some women, they're nuns, but you could see this as the coming to fruition of lay spirituality, but also lay intellectual life, scholarship and stuff like this, who see themselves as an elite who want to reform the larger, wider society. There's never more than a handful of people who are really engaged as Jansenists. What they have are a lot of sympathizers, as I think I've already said. And again, you can also see, again, especially the first generation or so, I mentioned how rigorous they were, how puritanical they could be. You can also see that in a more positive light. You could see it as an attempt by laymen, the lower clergy, to more fully live out their faith. And in fact, the fact they were rigorous contains a lot of truth. It should not be exaggerated, though, because the polemics between the Jansenists and the Jesuits tended to overplay each other's faults. Not all Jesuits were as lax as Blaise Pascal depicted them. A lot of them shared his critiques. So again, you can overdo that. Second thing, of course, is that when you see that how this movement's crushed by the state in France, when they're sort of, and by the Pope, when they are forced to be silent, when they get destroyed, it's still kept in movement, in being, as an intellectual endeavor, and which is touched by all these greater trends of the 17th and 18th centuries: greater historical research, emphasis on historical accuracy, the coming of greater literacy, um, greater skepticism toward popular piety. All these things go uh, in with this, but also, of course, it can be kept alive as a community by the medium of print and the networks that allows it to flourish. As you can see, demonstrated by the creation of the Nouvelle Ecclésiastique. And so it has those sorts of things in common with, say, the way, the Reformation or humanism. But perhaps above all, because again, if you don't see a lot of connection between the first incarnation of Jansenism and the second one in the 18th century, you're not wrong. There really isn't anything like literally logically connecting them. They're connected by historical circumstance. But one thing does connect them that sort of outlives all the changes in belief and doctrine that go on, is that they are both opposed to the living authority in church and state. This is the conclusion of William Doyle as an historian. They created habits of dissent from authority, which is weird because the original Jansenists were going, again, they were going back to church fathers like Augustine, going back to the Bible. Again, they have that in common with Protestant Reformation. In fact, when Jansenism as a theological debate dies down, the term Jansenism still, again, retained its meaning as a reference to any sort of opposition movement. And that's definitely one of the things that plays into the move toward, well, the French Revolution, but also modernity in general, if you want to define it that way. And then finally, I mentioned this back when my lecture on the Renaissance and Reformation, that the Renaissance, humanism, with its desire to go back to the sources, with its desire for a purified language, purified Latin, for a purified Christianity, but simpler, more easier for ordinary people to understand, was part of a wider trend toward intellectual simplicity and uniformity. The Protestant Reformation plays into this. Jansenism goes in the same direction. In fact, it feeds into, of course, it comes from those trends. It feeds into that trend, which meets its apotheosis really in what we're going to call the Enlightenment, because next time we'll finally talk about the Enlightenment. I put it off because I don't think it really has as much influence as people think until the latter half of the 18th century, until a lot of these other movements have died down, until that strong Augustinian mentality, which is so strong in France especially, begins to lose its hold on the public. And that's when you get Voltaire, the Encyclopédie, Rousseau, other thinkers coming into the fore and having an impact. Even though they're a tiny minority, they're already building on habits of dissent that have been created among the French clergy and even some laity by movements like Jansenism. So that is the lecture on Jansenism. I hope you got that was interesting, got a little bit of background. Next lecture, we're going to have the last one. We're going to lead you up to the very beginning of the French Revolution, about the origins of the French Revolution, the events, the ideas that play into it. And we're going to end with its beginning, because the French Revolution marks the dividing line. If you're talking about modern history, it begins with that. Your textbook will go through the actual events to a certain degree. But that's for next time. The next lecture you'll get on the origins of the French Revolution. Thank you guys for listening. Have a wonderful day. I'll see you guys next time.